I was given Apache twin sisters as a reward as slaves, but I did not take them but gave them for... The land stretched wide and mute, as if it had forgotten how to speak. Frost clung to the dry grass like stubborn ghosts, and a pale sun sat low behind the hills, offering no warmth, only light. Somewhere far off, a hawk circled slow and lazy, alone in the vast, aching sky. The ground beneath the boots of Thomas Greer crackled like brittle paper as he stepped out of the barn, the cold biting through the thick hide of his coat. He was a tall man, shaped by solitude and war, shoulders hunched like a man always bracing for something. His cabin, a small crooked thing made of pine and grief, stood behind him like a forgotten prayer. For years now, he had worked the land not to grow anything, but to keep himself moving. A man with no wife, no children, and no one to speak his name out loud. The war had taken the noise from his soul. What remained in him was silence. He was supposed to be receiving a reward that morning. They said he earned it, for the scouting he did for the Territorial Army, for the quiet way he helped them encircle camps, how he knew the land better than most white men. He hadn't asked for anything, but rewards came whether a man wanted them or not. When the wagon arrived, it carried more dust than kindness. 2 men jumped down. They didn't speak much, just nodded and lifted the canvas from the back. Beneath it, sitting on the rough wood bed, were 2 young Apache girls, barefoot, hands tied, dirt across their cheeks like bruises from the earth itself, maybe 15, maybe less. Twins. They didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared up at him with the hollow calm of those who had seen too much, too fast, too young. Thomas didn't move, his jaw locked, and something behind his ribs began to twist. The men slapped the side of the wagon and called it done. "You earned 'em," one said. 2 for the price of 1. Keep 'em fed or don't. Up to you." Then the wagon pulled away, wheels creaking into the distance. The girls sat on his land, bound and trembling, not from fear, from cold, from shame, from something deeper that language could not touch. Thomas didn't speak. He stepped forward, slow as smoke, and knelt. The girls flinched. He raised one hand, not to strike, but to pull out a small knife from his belt. And in that cold, breathless morning, with no one to witness but the frost and the trees, he cut their ropes and held still. They didn't run when the ropes were gone. The twin girls just sat there, hands resting in their laps, like they'd forgotten what freedom meant. Their eyes stayed low, avoiding his, not out of fear, but habit. The kind of habit you learn when looking someone in the eye had once cost you something. Food, safety, skin. Thomas stood over them, the knife still in his hand, unsure whether to drop it or use it on himself. He remembered a boy once, younger than these girls, maybe 12, in a Confederate uniform too big for his frame, limping across a field of burning wheat, dragging a broken musket and bleeding from the ear. That boy had seen his own father shot in the back. Thomas hadn't helped him, just watched him disappear into the smoke because helping meant slowing down, and slowing down meant dying. He remembered that boy now, remembered his own boots soaked in mud, his own breath tasting like gunpowder. That boy had no name in Thomas's memory, just eyes, wide, wet eyes, like these girls. The smaller twin, barely a difference in size, maybe just softer in the face, began to rub her wrist where the rope had bitten into the skin. Still silent. No tears. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from the tension of sitting still too long. Her shoulder flinched each time the wind brushed her cheek. Thomas took a step back. He could leave them, go inside, set a bowl of beans on the porch, and pretend that was enough. Let the prairie decide their fate. Let nature finish what war had started. Who'd blame him? They weren't his. They weren't anyone's now, except the ones who claimed them like cattle. He turned to go. His hand was on the door when he heard it. Not a voice, not a word. Just the sound of gravel shifting behind him. When he looked back, one of them had stood. Just stood. And looked at him. Her lips were cracked, her eyes sunken. But she looked. And that was worse than a scream. He stared at her, like a man staring into his own reflection, aged backward and brown-skinned, wearing scars not from battles won, but from being caught in the middle of other people's wars. Thomas opened the door, not for himself, for them. He left the door wide and walked in, not looking to see if they followed. He stoked the fire, fetched 2 cups, and filled them with warm water. No salt, no sugar, just heat. Then he sat at the table and waited. For a long moment, only the wind moved. And then, soft and soundless, the door creaked again. 2 shadows entered, one after the other. The smaller one hesitated at the threshold like a deer sniffing danger. The taller one nudged her gently inside. They didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't thank. But they came. And Thomas, without knowing when the decision was made, knew it was already done. The next morning brought nothing but silence. Thomas found the twins curled near the hearth, arms wrapped around each other like roots tangled underground. He didn't wake them. He just stood with his coffee and stared out the window. But silence never lasts long in a land soaked in blood. By midday, hoofbeats cracked through the dry hills. Not many. Just 3. Men who didn't care about being quiet, because they didn't believe they needed to be. Thomas stepped outside slowly. The wind had died, but dust still floated from their approach, slow, smug, sure. They were military scouts, but not the good kind, not regulation, not clean. These men worked for the bounty office out of Fort Wallace, a place where Indians were counted like deer and rewards were paid in human life. One of the men, a wiry bastard with a rust-colored mustache and a twisted smile, tipped his hat. "Thomas Greer," he said. "Heard you got your gift?" Thomas didn't reply. The man's eyes narrowed. "Colonel says those girls were taken off a raiding party. Said they helped kill a rancher down near Ellsworth. You letting murderers sleep by your fire now?" Thomas didn't flinch. "They're girls." "They're Apaches," the man spat. "Twins, no less. Sacred blood. Their kin'll come for 'em. Might already be close. You want to die in your sleep, fine. But don't say we didn't warn you." The other 2 shifted in their saddles. One tapped the butt of his rifle. "Bring 'em to the station," he said. "We'll take 'em back to the fort. Sell 'em off to someone who knows how to keep 'em quiet." Thomas stared at the dust on the man's boots, then up at his eyes. "They're not yours." "You think they're yours?" the leader scoffed. "We caught 'em. You're just the middleman, a tool." A long pause passed. Thomas could feel his heartbeat thudding in his throat. He knew their type, men who mistook cruelty for strength. He'd once fought beside them, then against them. The difference had always been paper-thin. "I'll bring them tomorrow," Thomas lied. The men exchanged looks. Then the leader nodded. "Midday. Don't make us come back." They rode off, dust rising like smoke in their wake. That night, Thomas sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, his revolver loaded beside him. The girls sat across from him, silent, until the taller one whispered something. The first word since they'd arrived. "Naichi." He looked up. "My sister's name," she said, voice barely air. "And yours?" Thomas asked. She paused. Then, "Tacklish." Thomas nodded, as if receiving something sacred. The door creaked. The wind picked up, and in the dark horizon beyond the hills he saw faint flickers, firelight, signals, watching eyes. They weren't safe anymore. Not from the soldiers, not from the bounty men, and not from the ones who wanted the girls back, dead or alive. The days that followed moved slowly, like breath held under water. The girls didn't speak again, but they stayed close, not out of trust, not yet, but necessity. The cabin was the only place without eyes, the only place with fire and a roof. Thomas built a second bed from old fencewood and stuffed it with wool. He didn't offer it to them directly, just laid it near the hearth and turned away. That night he found it empty, both girls still curled together on the floor. He let them. Each morning, he cooked beans and cornbread without seasoning. He left it on the table and went outside to chop wood. When he returned, the plates were empty, the girls silent. On the third morning, the taller one, Tacklish, followed him to the chopping block. She stood behind him, arms crossed tight. Then, slowly, she picked up a split log and carried it to the stack. One piece, then another. She never looked at him. He never thanked her. By the fourth day, Naichi began tending the fire on her own. It was on the fifth day that Thomas brought out the rifle. He didn't speak, just set it on the stump outside, then sat back and watched. Tacklish approached first. She touched it like something poisonous, then she held it. It didn't shake in her hands. He showed her how to load it, how to rest it against the shoulder, how to breathe before pulling the trigger. She watched, then tried, missed, then again, hit a rock clean through. Naichi stood near the doorway, watching with wide, silent eyes. Later that evening, Thomas sat sharpening a blade in the quiet of the porch. The girls sat nearby, wrapped in a single old quilt. The wind was softer now, brushing past like a sigh. For the first time, Naichi spoke. "Why do you live alone?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He stared at the horizon, then said, "I had a brother. He didn't come back from the war, I did. But not all of me." Naichi looked at him. "My father died in war too. Our village was burned after. Then we were taken." Silence returned. Then Tacklish stood, walked over and sat beside him. She reached out and turned his hand palm up, scarred, rough, burnt in one place. She touched her own forearm, a matching mark, older, healed badly. A burn. Branding, maybe. He nodded. They didn't speak again that night. But the bond had formed, not with language, but with weight. The weight of things survived, of things endured. Later, Thomas placed the rifle beside their bed, not as a warning, as trust. And that night, as wind curled through the broken seams of the cabin walls, the silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like peace, brief, borrowed, but real, like the still moment before thunder. The morning came without color, just grey light spilling across the plains, the kind that made even shadows feel tired. Thomas stood at the edge of his porch, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the road like a man expecting death, not running from it. At exactly midday, the dust rose. The bounty riders were back. 3 horses, 3 rifles, 3 grins too wide for what they came to do. Tacklish and Naichi stood inside the cabin. Thomas had told them to hide. They didn't listen. They stood near the window, hands clenched, shoulders squared. No more flinching, no more waiting to be taken. The leader dismounted and spat into the dirt. "Didn't figure you'd be stupid enough to keep 'em," he said. Thomas didn't answer. His rifle stayed steady, the barrel pointed at the ground, but only just. "You think this is about choice?" the man sneered. "You think these girls belong to anyone but the fort? They're property, and you—" He stepped closer. "You're just a tenant on land that don't forget who owns it." Behind him, one of the others cocked his weapon. The sound cracked the stillness like a bone. Thomas raised his eyes. "They're not going with you." The leader laughed. "Then I reckon we'll take 'em over your dead body." That's when the cabin door creaked. Naichi stepped out. Behind her, Tacklish followed, both barefoot, both holding small blades from Thomas's kitchen. Not weapons, symbols. "No," Thomas hissed. "Back inside." But they didn't move, and the riders saw it. "She speaks now," the man grinned. "Look at that. Pretty little things getting brave." He stepped toward Naichi. Thomas raised his rifle. "One more step." And then came the twist. Not from the front, but from behind. The wind shifted, horses neighed, and from the ridge behind the cabin, 6 riders appeared, silent, painted, armed. Apache warriors, watching. Tacklish saw them first. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "They followed us," she whispered. "They came." The bounty riders turned, startled. One dropped his rifle. Another tried to mount his horse but stumbled. The leader looked at Thomas, fury twisting his face. "You brought them here?" Thomas didn't answer. He wasn't sure himself. What he did know was that this was the reckoning. The leader raised his gun. Too slow. Thomas fired once. The man dropped. The others froze as the Apache riders advanced. No shots. Just presence. Like ghosts returning for what was stolen. The confrontation ended without a war. The riders disarmed. The bodies buried. And Thomas stood, smoke curling from his rifle, knowing full well that he'd made a choice, not between life or death, but between silence and truth. He had chosen them, and in doing so, might have lost everything. But finally, he had something worth losing. The wind moved slow across the hills, carrying the scent of gunpowder and dry blood. The man Thomas shot lay in a shallow grave behind the barn. He didn't mark it, didn't say a prayer, just shoveled until the body was gone, and the dirt looked like it had never been touched. The other 2 bounty riders were gone, sent back on foot with nothing but shame and bruise, as the Apache riders let them go. Mercy, perhaps, or warning. Thomas hadn't spoken since the shot. Tacklish stood by the well, bucket hanging half-raised in her hand. Naiche sat on the cabin steps, arms around her knees, eyes tracing the horizon where their kin had disappeared hours earlier. Quiet, as they had come. They had not stayed. They had not embraced. They had only looked at the girls, long, searching looks, and nodded. A kind of reunion that spoke more through eyes than words. Thomas wondered if they would come back, if the girls would leave. That night, the fire burned low. They didn't light candles. The quiet was thick, like snow pressing in on the world. Naiche handed Thomas a strip of cloth, the edge of her old dress, and pointed at his shoulder. The rifle kick had torn the skin. She cleaned the wound without flinching. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect it. When she was done, she set the cloth on the table and went to sit beside her sister. Thomas looked at the door. It was open a crack. Beyond it, the prairie stretched out, endless and unknowable. The path forward held no promise, only survival. And maybe, just maybe, healing. He walked outside, boots thudding soft against the dry porch, looked up at the stars. So many it hurt the eyes. Footsteps followed. Tacklish stood beside him, arms folded, face to the wind. She didn't speak. She just leaned her head lightly, barely against his arm, not seeking comfort, but offering it. Inside, Naiche stoked the fire. A small glow, enough to keep the cold at bay. The night passed with no words, only the crackle of flame, only breath. And when morning came, the door was still open. Seasons passed like shadows stretching across the land. The snow came late that winter, and the cold lingered long into spring, but the cabin stood firm, its roof patched, its hearth warm, its silence no longer empty, but sacred, like a church with no name. Thomas rarely spoke still, but the silence had softened around him. It no longer felt like punishment, just space, room for breathing, room for something to grow. The girls stayed. Not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they chose to. They planted corn behind the cabin, raised chickens in a crooked coop they built from old fencing and scrap wood. On Sundays, Thomas showed them how to shoot better, On Thursdays, they cooked beans with a pinch of pepper and something that smelled like memory. They never called him father. He never asked for it. But they were no longer just strangers in the same place. They were a kind of family. The kind that's forged in fire, not blood. Sometimes riders passed through, soldiers, traders, men asking questions. They never stayed long. Something in Thomas's eyes, or perhaps in the twin stares behind him, made them think twice. One spring morning, a letter arrived, folded neatly. No return address. Inside it, a name was written in charcoal, Nietzsche, and a feather, soft, brown, striped, from far away. She didn't cry, but she held it close for hours, then tucked it in the beams above her bed, a silent promise to someone watching from beyond. Tacklish began carving small animals out of wood, rabbits, birds, horses. She left them along the windowsill, watching the seasons change behind them. Thomas kept the rifle near the door, but he hadn't loaded it in months. One evening, as the sky burned orange behind the hills, the three of them sat on the porch. No words, just the creak of old wood and the hum of insects settling in the dusk. Nietzsche leaned her head on her sister's shoulder. Tacklish's fingers absent-mindedly traced the edge of a wooden sparrow she'd made. Thomas rocked slowly, boots resting on the rail. For once, the ache in his chest didn't feel like guilt. It felt like a memory. Fading, but not forgotten. He looked at them. Two girls once given to him as a prize. Now living as people. Whole. Scarred, but breathing. He didn't rescue them. They rescued him. And long after the world forgot their names, the land would still remember the quiet house on the ridge where no one raised their voice. But everything changed. And in that silence, they healed, not loud like thunder, but soft, like rain no longer afraid to fall.